Good morning, Christian Fellowship Center, CFC, our beloved congregation of friends and fellow pilgrims. I've been thinking about the book of Daniel. I'll spend a little bit of time there today and maybe into the future. Today I want to spend some time in chapter 1 and chapter 3. But Daniel has so much material, prophetic material, truth material that reminds us that the Bible is the Word of God, and we'll get through some of that a little bit later. But in light of our COVID struggles and uncertainty about where the culture is going politically, culturally, what does it mean to be faithful in the midst of, shall we say, fiery furnaces, that focus of chapter 3? Particularly as we're thinking about our fellow citizens in the western states. We're thinking about the folks who have been ministered to by Andrew and Liz and that ministry. I know that Judith has been to the island off off of Greece, and to know the grief of that fire. We can only imagine, but we can only pray and ask the Lord to help us to be faithful in bearing the burdens of others. No person is useless in this world, Charles Dickens said, who bears the burden of someone else, bears the burdens of another. But let's start with some glimpses from Daniel chapter 1. Hope despite threatening furnaces. And as we've mentioned, we've had a number of them, culturally, subculturally, interpersonally, familially, nationally. But CFC, near the end of the 7th century of the birth of Christ, 3 young men were selected from the throngs of Israeli exiles in Babylon. We can't imagine being conquered militarily and then being displaced, taken away from the land that we know and moved somewhere else. By the way, that was a conquering policy probably invented by the Assyrian Empire, but mastered by the Babylonians. These were 3 men selected amongst the Israeli exiles in Babylon by the Babylonian king, and we're glad that we don't have to know how to spell his name, but we know it, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar and his officials chose these men to be highly trained as future administrators and counselors in the Babylonian Empire. And think about this. It was really a brilliant administrative move of the empire's leaders to say, look, we want the next generation of the people that we conquered committed ideally to our empire's future and not stuck into the glories of their nation's past. And that was the challenge of the Babylonian Empire for everyone they had conquered. And this was a very, very wise policy for them. Okay. Of course, a young Daniel who had taken the name, and we forget this sometimes, he had taken on the pagan name Belteshazzar. You can find this in chapter 1, verse 7. Was also a member of that highly prized group of young leaders in training. Israelites preparing to serve the Babylonian Empire. This was a long way from the glories of David and Solomon. And in some ways, the fact that Daniel and his 3 colleagues, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, would take on pagan names Think of this. In some ways, that is the most intriguing aspect of the story, in my view. All four of these young men allowed themselves to take on pagan titles, names that asserted the validity of false gods that they knew, of course, in their heart of hearts were false. Yet at the same time, as described in Daniel chapter 1 these three men refused to eat the training table food the pagan chefs set before them. They took on the pagan names, but turned away from the pagan food. Now, it would probably seem to most of us, 21st century dwellers, that a more profound commitment to holiness and godly principle would be to refuse the pagan names and succumb to the menu of the Babylonian training table. It's only food. It's only pagan food. We might call their decision sticking points. This was a distinction made by a mentor of mine, a wonderful mentor, the British philosopher, Baptist pastor John Peck, who ministered with me at Trinity Church in Livonia in the 80s. And John and his fellow congregants were the founders of the Greenbelt Arts Festival, probably one of the largest arts festival that happens to be organized and sponsored by Christians in the world. But a wonderful, wonderful philosopher and wonderful mentor for me. And some of you have heard his I Have a Vision that is a Shema of mine in many ways from John Peck. But he was the first to point this out in this famous story. Look at, these are sticking points. These young men took on the pagan names, and we know their Hebrew names as well. We know their Israeli names, but we also know their pagan names. But they would not take on the pagan food. This is what he described again as a sticking point. And theirs were probably different sticking points than ours. In our contemporary setting, we might say, don't pin on me the pagan names, but we'll eat the pagan food. Okay, it's only food, and we'll listen to the pagan music, of course. It's probably good to recognize that as Christians, we will sometimes have different sticking points. Take a look at Romans 14 to see what the Apostle Paul had to say to the Roman Christians about such differences. You remember that portion where some were eating meat sacrificed to idols and others weren't. Some were holding certain high holy days, others saw every day alike. And the Apostle Paul says, learn how to be gracious even in the midst of your doctrinally debatable issues, your scruples, your differing sticking points. Some of you might remember that I had presented a while ago from a concentric circle chart that I had developed, different debatable topics and 5 different concentric circle categories. This is a lot of what John Peck called sticking points, and what I'm saying describes this decision of Shadrach and Abednego to take on the pagan names, but not the pagan food. Again, then we jumped to chapter 3, and a story that is equally well-known and influential. The profoundly dramatic and courageous exchange of Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego with their king Nebuchadnezzar. Strangely, the king of the Babylonian Empire, which made him the most powerful person in the then-known world, probably, decides to have constructed a 90-foot statue and require that everyone bow down to it. And if you read the story, you have some of the backdrop of the rationale of Nebuchadnezzar as informed by his wise men. Some of them somewhat intimidated and challenged and threatened by these Israeli leaders. Of course, unique to worshiping the God of the devout Israelite was that no other God was to be exalted, nor any image or likeness to be formed, strictly forbidden in the 3rd of the 10 Commandments, found in Deuteronomy chapter 5 and Exodus chapter 20. But the emperor here of Babylon demands that his subjects bow down to the idol he has made, an image probably of the ancient god Nabu, forcing each resident of the empire to demonstrate their ultimate allegiance to the authority, to his authority, and to his grandeur, both that god and Nebuchadnezzar. This command was a common means of ensuring the cultural glue that held an empire together. And of course, CFC, it would later be employed by Roman emperors throughout the first several centuries of church history. These Roman emperors seeking to unify the allegiance of their subjects under the common pledge to a Roman god. And you can read in church history of story after story after story of Christian martyrs who, in the spirit of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to succumb to the demands of the Roman emperor that a little bit of incense be sprinkled on the fires and prayers of allegiance to the Roman emperor god. And here comes another sticking point for the three young men in chapter 3. An unwillingness, again, to bow down and worship anyone but the living God, the maker of the heavens and the earth. This refusal might cost them their lives. The three tell their earthly king that the God they serve is able to save them from the fiery furnace Nebuchadnezzar set up to incinerate the non-compliant. We want you to know, it says in Daniel chapter 3, verse 16, that the God that we serve is able to rescue us from the flame of your furnace. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not bow down to the golden image you have set up. Then came again their additional comment, demonstrating even greater faith in the living God. Even if the Lord chooses not to rescue them from the fiery furnace, and they die as flaming embers to God's sovereignty and providence, they still will not bow down to the golden image. They reassert their dutiful allegiance to Nebuchadnezzar by again addressing him as king. But they cannot disregard their ultimate allegiance to the King of Kings in order to spare themselves from the terror of being thrown into the furnace. You see this in Daniel chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. And again, CFC, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's ultimate hope was not the preservation of their current status as highly trusted governors in the Babylonian Empire, nor even the sparing of their own lives. Their courage and conviction at the time of their inferno of testing was traced to faith in the eternal promises of God, who would never leave them nor forsake them, in life or in death. They knew the promises of God in the Pentateuch, found in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 6. I will never leave you nor forsake you. They knew the promise of Joshua chapter 1, verses 7 through 9. Do not be discouraged, do not be terrified, for the Lord your God has promised to be with you wherever you go. They probably were retrieving those texts as they were reminded of the eternal presence, preservation, power, and promises of God. Again, they believed that their God would never leave them in life or in death. Their hope was built on nothing less, shall we say, than this. And of course, they would miraculously survive the fiery testing. Certainly unlike thousands and thousands and thousands of Christian martyrs who saw in these three young men the model of courage into the eternities. Many Christian martyrs, as I said, in later centuries would find inspiration and hope in the witness of these three men, even if their immediate result was to be eaten alive by wild beasts, burned at the stake, or crucified as was their Lord. And remember that just a few years after the recipients of that Roman letter referenced earlier, Just a few years after that, many of the Roman Christians would be dying in the arena and crucified on a cross. Biblical history, CFC, and in many ways all history, including our history as a church, our history as individuals, the history of our relationships and our families. Biblical history, all history, provides us with context for the grace and necessity of hope. That hope which fuels a persistence in loving faithfulness. May we continue to stay faithful to our loving and gracious and ever-providing God, even in the midst of these uncertain times. May the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face to shine upon you. Amen.